The wind rolled through the canyon like a freight train, howling low and wild as dark clouds smothered the last light of the afternoon. On the edge of a winding river in the Montana frontier, the storm struck without mercy. Ella Granger tightened her grip on her little sister's wrist as rain pelted their faces, mixing with tears and sweat. The two girls had been on their way home from the trading post when the floodwaters rose with terrifying speed. What was once a gentle creek had turned into a raging monster. "Come on, Sadie, just a little further!" Ella shouted over the roar, her boots slipping on the muddy slope. Sadie, barely 17 and trembling with fear, clung to Ella's arm. I can't. My foot!" A sudden crack echoed like a rifle shot. A massive branch came crashing down beside them, missing them by inches. The bank gave way beneath their feet. In one heart-stopping moment, both girls were swept into the cold, surging current. Farther upriver, a lone rider spotted the movement. He reined in his horse sharply, the animal snorting at the scent of rain and fear. Calder Beck had seen floods before, but nothing like this. He was a man of the land, tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-creased skin, and a quiet strength that made people listen when he spoke. But right now, there was no time for talking. He kicked his boots free of the stirrups and dove into the water without hesitation. The current was merciless, but so was Calder when it came to saving lives. He caught Ella first, her fingers slipping from a fallen tree trunk. With one arm around her waist, he reached for Sadie just as the younger girl disappeared beneath the surface. His lungs burned, his arms ached, but he didn't stop. When he finally dragged both girls to the bank, he collapsed beside them, coughing hard, soaked to the bone. Minutes passed before Ella blinked up at the stranger who had risked everything for them. You saved us," she whispered, shivering. Calder looked at her, into those deep brown eyes filled with fear, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Both of you." And though none of them could have known it, that single act of courage would tie their lives together in ways that none of them could have imagined. Not yet. But soon, very soon, the old cabin was barely visible through the curtain of rain, nestled behind a thicket of pine trees and brush. Calder half-carried the girls up the slick trail, his arms aching but steady. The moment they reached the door, he pushed it open with his shoulder and guided them inside. The cabin was simple. Wooden floors, stone fireplace, a cot, and a few worn blankets folded in a trunk, but it was dry. It smelled of cedar and years of use, and tonight it was salvation. Ella collapsed near the hearth, trembling. Sadie's lips were blue. Calder wasted no time. He grabbed logs and kindling, striking a match with calloused fingers. The fire came alive with a crackle, casting light on the soaked trio. "I'll get you dry clothes," he said, pulling open a chest. "They'll be big, but warm." Ella looked up, water dripping from her hair. "Thank you. Again." He didn't reply right away. He was busy tending to the flames, his face focused. But inside, he felt something stir, something unfamiliar, unsettling. He had been alone for a long time, too long. A half-hour later, the sisters were wrapped in flannel shirts and oversized trousers. Sadie lay asleep by the fire, breathing steady. Ella sat nearby, her arms folded around her knees. "You live out here alone?" she asked softly. Calder nodded, staring into the flames. "Been that way for some years." "No family?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She didn't press. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but delicate. She noticed the way he avoided eye contact, the way he sat on the edge of the shadows, as though he didn't quite believe he belonged near warmth anymore. "You saved us without even knowing our names," she said. Calder looked at her then. Really looked. The flickering firelight softened her features, mud-streaked, weary, but striking. "I didn't need your names to know you were worth saving," he replied, quiet as the embers. Outside, the storm began to move on, leaving a stillness behind. Inside, something unspoken hung in the air. Something neither of them dared name. Not yet. But in the silence, something was beginning. Sunlight filtered in through the cracks in the wooden walls, painting thin golden lines across the floorboards. The fire had died to a soft glow, and the scent of pine smoke clung to the air. For the first time in days, the world felt still. Ella woke slowly, her body aching from exhaustion, but warm. She blinked, trying to remember where she was. And then it all came rushing back. The river, the rain, the man who dove in without hesitation. Sadie was curled beside her, still wrapped in Calder's oversized flannel shirt. She looked peaceful, finally. Ella pulled the blanket a little tighter around her sister's shoulders before getting to her feet. She found Calder outside, already at work. He was splitting logs behind the cabin, shirt sleeves rolled up, jaw tight with focus. The morning sun cast a soft glow across the clearing, glinting off droplets still clinging to the leaves. "You don't sleep much, do you?" she called. He paused, glanced over his shoulder. "Old habit." She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the damp ground. "You don't have to keep doing all this. You've done more than enough." He set the axe down gently, brushing his hands on his trousers. "You're not ready to ride out just yet. And that road's still flooded. You're safe here until it dries." Ella studied him for a long moment. There was something about Calder that didn't quite fit. He had the hands of a rancher, the eyes of a man who'd seen too much, and the voice of someone who spoke only when it truly mattered. "Do you always live this far from everyone?" she asked. Calder hesitated. "I lost my brother, and after that, town got too loud." She nodded quietly. "I understand." By midday, Sadie was awake and sitting on the porch, watching chipmunks dart through the trees. Calder brought her a piece of jerky and an old harmonica to distract her, and she giggled as she tried to play a note. Ella leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, watching him. "You're good with her," he shrugged. "Had a niece once. She liked to sit just like that, feet dangling, asking me 100 questions before noon." Ella smiled. It was the first time she had seen something soft in him, like warmth trapped under layers of guarded silence. She looked out at the land, wide and wild, framed by cottonwoods and the scent of pine in the air. "You think maybe, after the road clears, we could come back sometime? Just to say thank you?" Calder looked up at her, and for the first time he smiled. "I'd like that." But deep in the trees, something else was moving. A rider, a shadow from the girl's past, and what started as a rescue was about to become something much more dangerous. That afternoon, as the sun arced over the mountains and turned the sky a gentle amber, Calder stood at the edge of his property. A soft breeze rustled the tall grasses, and somewhere in the trees, a hawk cried out. Everything seemed calm, but he didn't trust it. His instincts, shaped by years on the frontier and sharpened by quiet loss, whispered something was off. Not in the wind, not in the weather. In the air. He stepped toward the old fence line and scanned the hills beyond the trees. And there it was, almost too faint to see. Dust! A thin rising plume far off on the trail. Inside the cabin, Sadie laughed as she tried to braid her hair with trembling fingers. Ella sat by the window, patching a torn seam in her dress, her eyes drifting now and then to the door, wondering if Calder would return soon. She didn't know why his absence pulled at her so quickly. Didn't know why his silence filled her ears even louder than his words ever had. "He's nice," Sadie said suddenly. "I like him." Ella smiled without looking up. "He saved our lives. That's worth a lot." Sadie watched her for a moment. "That's not the only reason you like him." Ella paused in her stitching. "I can tell." Calder came back through the cabin door quietly, dust still clinging to his boots. "There's someone out there," he said, his voice low and steady. "Maybe half a day's ride off. Too far to see who, but someone's coming." Ella's heart skipped. "Could be a traveler," she offered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Could be," Calder replied, but his eyes said otherwise. That night, Calder slept on the floor near the door, rifle within reach. He didn't say much over supper. Neither did Ella, but their silence was shared, like a pact sealed in firelight. Sadie, ever trusting, curled up on the cot and drifted off with ease. Ella stayed up, watching the way the light played across Calder's face, the hard lines, the stillness of him. She didn't know much about his past, but she could feel its weight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He looked over, surprised by the softness in her voice. "For keeping us safe, even now." Calder held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. "I won't let anything happen to either of you." But out beyond the hills, the rider kept moving, slow and steady. And he wasn't coming for kindness. He was coming for what he thought was his. By morning, the dust cloud had grown closer, no longer a whisper on the horizon, but a clear signal of approach. Calder stood with his hand on the fence post, eyes narrowed as the lone rider crested the distant ridge. The figure was upright, confident, not lost, not friendly. Calder didn't move. He simply watched. Inside the cabin, Ella felt the tension before she heard the hooves. Calder's quiet way of pacing near the window was enough to set her nerves on edge. She peeked out and saw the horseman nearing, a thick coat flapping behind him, a rifle tied to the saddle. Her stomach dropped. Sadie, half-dressed and brushing out her damp hair, turned toward her. "What's wrong?" Ella didn't answer. She didn't need to, because when the man pulled up in front of the cabin, his voice cracked the air like a whip. "Ella Granger, I know you're in there!" Calder stepped onto the porch, calm but unyielding. "Don't know who you are, but if you're bringing trouble, you'd best turn around now." The rider dismounted. A long scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, and the smirk on his face was one Ella hadn't seen in months but would never forget, would never. Matthew Kane, her former fiancé. Her mistake. The man who said she'd marry him or no one else would. "I came for what's mine," he said, glancing toward the cabin. "And she knows exactly why." Inside, Sadie gasped, her face going pale. "He found us!" Ella locked the door, though she knew it wouldn't stop him if he really meant to push. She turned to her sister, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay here, no matter what." Outside, Calder stepped off the porch, putting himself between Matthew and the cabin. "She's not yours," he said evenly. "And I don't reckon you're welcome here." Matthew laughed coldly. "She ran from our wedding and stole from me. You think I crossed 3 counties just to turn back now? I don't care what you think you're owed. You come any closer, and I'll take it as a threat." For a moment, the only sound was the horse snorting between them. Then Matthew grinned and spat in the dirt. "This ain't over." He mounted back up and rode off, but not fast. Not far. Just out of sight, waiting. That evening, Calder boarded the windows and double-checked every latch. He didn't speak much, but his movements were sure. Prepared. Protective. Ella sat near the fire, Sadie curled against her, shaking. "I should have told you sooner," Ella whispered. Calder looked up from the door. "Doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is you're not alone now." And for the first time since fleeing Matthew's threats, Ella truly believed that might be true. But night was falling, and men like Matthew Kane didn't give up easy. The wind outside had gone still, and with it came a tension that clung to the walls of the cabin like smoke. Calder sat near the window, rifle across his knees, boots planted firm on the floor. He didn't look tired, even though he hadn't slept. He looked ready. Ella sat across the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes tracing the silhouette of the man who now stood between her and a past she thought she'd escaped. Sadie, for all her strength, had cried herself to sleep. The quiet kind of crying, silent, steady, the kind that took hours to run dry. Ella didn't know how to thank him anymore. Words felt small, not enough for the man who had pulled her from a river and now stood watch through the night. She spoke softly, not wanting to wake her sister. "I was supposed to marry him because my father said it was the only way to save our land," she said. "I didn't love him. I didn't even know him. But Matthew, he didn't care. He just wanted ownership. Me, the farm, the name." Calder didn't interrupt. "I ran before the ceremony. Took Sadie with me. We left everything behind, and I thought maybe we could just disappear." "You did what you had to do," Calder said finally, his voice low. "No one should live like that. No woman belongs to a man like she's a piece of property." Ella looked at him through the firelight. "You're not like most men." He turned slightly toward her, one brow raised. "That a good thing?" She smiled faintly. "The best kind." Hours passed. Then came the crack of a branch outside. Calder rose instantly, motioning for Ella to stay low. He crossed the floor in 2 strides and peered through the side window, lifting the rifle slowly. Matthew wasn't alone. 3 men were moving through the trees behind him. Hired guns, from the look of them. One carried a lantern. Another held a rope. "They're here," Calder muttered. "And they're not just here to talk." He moved fast, loading extra rounds into his rifle and checking the sidearm beneath his belt. Then he opened a trap door near the hearth and pulled out a battered satchel. "Take Sadie and go," he said, pressing the satchel into Ella's hands. "There's a back trail. Head north toward the ridgeline. Stay in the trees. Ride straight until you see the Twin Rocks. There's a hunting cabin there, belongs to a friend." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered, fire in her eyes. "You have to." She shook her head. "No, not again. I ran once. I won't run while someone else fights for me." Calder's jaw clenched, not in anger, but in something deeper. Something that felt like fear. Not for himself. For her. "You're not just someone else," he said. And before either of them could speak again, a rock smashed through the front window. Outside, the night came alive with voices. Matthew had come to reclaim what he thought he lost. But he had no idea what he was walking into. Glass scattered across the cabin floor like sharp stars. Sadie jolted awake with a gasp, eyes wide, reaching for her sister. Ella was already beside her, arms wrapped around the younger girl, shielding her from the danger outside. Calder didn't flinch. He moved to the shattered window and crouched low, his rifle aimed steady through the opening. "Show yourself!" Matthew's voice rang out in the dark, bold with arrogance. "You're outnumbered, cowboy. That girl belongs to me, and I'll have her one way or another. You'll get nothing but lead if you take another step, Calder called back, voice sharp as steel. Go home. A pause, then laughter. Cruel, confident, and then footsteps. Ella helped Sadie into the crawl space Calder had shown her before. The girl's eyes were filled with terror, but she nodded. You'll be right behind me? I promise, Ella whispered, brushing hair from her sister's forehead. Stay low, stay quiet. She closed the hatch gently, then turned and picked up a rifle Calder had set aside. Her hands trembled, but her heart was steady. Calder saw her and frowned. I told you to go. I told you I wouldn't, she answered. I may not shoot like you do, but I've faced worse things than bullets. He held her gaze for a moment, something unspoken flickering between them. Pride, fear, admiration, maybe more. Then he nodded once. The first man came around the side. Calder fired, and the figure went down with a grunt, dropping his lantern in the wet grass. Light bloomed for just a second, enough to see another one duck behind the woodpile. A shot cracked the stillness. A second bullet splintered the porch rail inches from Ella's shoulder. Calder pushed her down behind the doorframe. You stay covered, he hissed. Don't be a hero. Too late, she said, reloading with shaky hands. Another crash, this time from the back. Matthew's men had circled wide, trying to break through the rear window. Calder rushed to intercept, firing again, driving them back with precision honed over years of wilderness survival. But there were too many. He knew it, and Ella knew it too. Then, above the gunfire and shouts, came a sharp whistle and the sound of hooves. From the northern trees, two riders emerged, Calder's neighbors, alerted by the dust trail he'd left earlier in the day, armed and ready. One carried a shotgun, the other a long rifle. Thought you might need a hand, the older one called out as he fired into the air. Matthew's men scattered. Two ran. One was pulled from the brush and disarmed. Matthew himself stood frozen, caught between the barrel of a rifle and the fury in Ella's eyes. You never owned me, she said, stepping forward. And you never will. Calder lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. Matthew sneered but said nothing as the men tied his hands and led him to the horses. Silence fell again. Not the silence of fear, but of relief, of something finally ending. Or perhaps finally beginning. Ella turned toward Calder, her dress torn, her hair wild from wind and firelight. You okay? He asked quietly. She nodded. You? Better than I've been in years. She looked at him, eyes soft and steady. You saved us again. Calder smiled faintly. Maybe this time you saved me too. The morning after felt like the world had held its breath all night, and finally exhaled. A golden hush lay across the land. Mist drifted low over the meadow, and the scent of pine and damp earth hung in the still air. Calder stood by the fence, gazing out over the land that had been his retreat for so long. But it no longer felt like solitude. It felt like a home waiting to be filled. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Ella stepped out, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders. The bruises on her arms were fading, but the fire in her gaze had only grown stronger. He won't come back, Calder said without turning. No, she replied, he won't. There was peace in her voice, the kind that had been absent for too long. Inside, Sadie was helping one of Calder's neighbors pack up their supplies. She was cheerful again, her voice lighter, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden and had finally set it down. You planning to leave? The neighbor asked. Sadie paused. I don't know, not today. And neither did Ella, because when the danger had passed and the adrenaline faded, what remained was something new. Quiet looks, gentle moments, a pull that felt less like safety and more like belonging. Later that afternoon, Calder sat at the porch steps, sharpening a blade. Ella walked out and handed him a cup of coffee. You always this prepared for trouble? She asked, half teasing. He chuckled low. Trouble tends to find me. She sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. You said you were alone after your brother passed, she said. Ever think about starting over? He nodded slowly. More lately than ever before. She sipped her coffee. What would that look like for you? Calder looked at her. Really looked. Her profile was calm, strong. Not just beautiful, but brave. Grounded. It might look something like this, he said. She met his eyes. Then maybe I'm thinking the same. That night, the three of them sat by the fire. No fear, no shadows. Just warmth. Calder reached for Ella's hand, hesitating only a second before their fingers laced together, and for once there was no need for words. The storm had passed, but something else had just begun. Weeks passed. The river calmed, the road dried, and wildflowers began to push up through the earth as if the land itself had waited for peace. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm. Calder would rise before dawn, tending to the land, chopping wood, riding out to check the cattle that grazed farther down the slope. Ella and Sadie would cook, clean, and sometimes ride into the nearby town for supplies, always returning with fresh stories and laughter that Calder quietly treasured. It was no longer just survival, it was living. Sadie bloomed in the quiet of the woods. Her voice, once hushed by fear, now rang bright in the morning light. She read books by the porch, chased dragonflies near the stream, and took to whittling with Calder's guidance. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she admitted one day, eyes on the cedar shavings falling to her feet. "You are now," Calder said, "and you always will be here." She smiled and didn't look away. "You talk like this place has room for more than just you." He gave her a rare grin. "It does." Ella found herself looking at the same valley each morning, asking the same question. What if we stayed? She wasn't used to the idea of permanence, not after what she'd run from. But Calder's steadiness, his way of letting her speak when she needed to and be silent when she didn't, had carved out something inside her she hadn't dared feel before. Hope. One afternoon, Calder brought her to the edge of a field. "Used to be my brother's idea to build another cabin here. Said one day I'd need more space." Ella looked out over the grassy rise, the way it caught the wind like a sail. "It's beautiful," she said. He hesitated. "You think you and Sadie might want to make this land yours too?" Ella turned to face him, her heart suddenly loud in her chest. "You mean stay?" "I mean build something, together." She didn't answer at first. She simply stepped forward and rested her hand over his. "I already started," she said softly. That evening, Sadie found a faded ribbon and braided it into Ella's hair. "For when you say yes," she teased. Ella laughed. "Who says I haven't already?" But just as the roots of something real began to grow, a letter arrived in town, from someone neither of them expected, and it would change everything. Again, it was Sadie who picked it up first. The letter had been slid under the door of the trading post in town. No return name, no seal. Just, "To Miss Ella Granger," scrawled in hard, deliberate handwriting across the front. She held it close on the wagon ride home, fingers fidgeting with the edges. Something about it felt heavy, important, maybe even dangerous. When they arrived at the cabin, the wind had picked up, and the smell of early autumn hung in the air. Sadie handed it to her sister without a word, and Ella stared at it for a long moment before walking inside. She sat at the table. Calder stood nearby, leaning in the doorway, arms crossed as he watched her eyes scan the envelope. "From town?" he asked. She nodded. "But not from anyone I know." With careful hands, she tore it open. The letter was short, no more than a few lines, written in neat, unfamiliar script. "Miss Granger, I believe I know where your mother is. She didn't die in the fire, as you were told. Come to Bitter Ridge before the first snow. I will explain everything there." A friend. The world seemed to tip sideways. Ella blinked once, twice. Her heart pounded in her ears. She hadn't heard her mother's name spoken in years, not since the fire that had claimed their family home. They'd been told there were no survivors. No chance. It was what drove their father to desperation, what pushed Ella into Matthew's arms. What sent them down the trail of fear and running? "What is it?" Calder asked gently. Ella slid the paper across the table. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening. That night, Ella sat by the fire, the letter folded in her lap. Sadie sat beside her, head on her shoulder. "Do you think it's real?" Sadie whispered. "I don't know," Ella replied, "but I have to find out." Calder knelt before them, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then we go. All of us." Ella shook her head. "It could be dangerous. You've given us peace here, Calder. I won't ask you to give it up for shadows." He looked up at her, steady as the mountains outside. "You didn't ask. I offered." And so it was decided. In a few days they'd pack their supplies, saddle the horses, and leave the valley behind. At least for a while. For answers. For truth. For the chance to face what was lost. And maybe reclaim what still remained. But none of them knew. What waited in Bitter Ridge would test everything they'd built, and threaten the love just beginning to take root. The morning they left, a thin frost had crept across the grass like a whispered warning. Calder saddled the horses in silence, his movements smooth and precise. Ella packed the provisions with steady hands, though her mind raced. Sadie buzzed with nervous energy, clutching her worn shawl tight as she climbed into the wagon. Bitter Ridge lay nearly 2 days' ride north, cutting through sharp canyons, pine thickets, and land most folks avoided after autumn. The trail wasn't dangerous by nature, but its silence was thick, lonely. As the cabin disappeared behind them, Ella felt the pull of something deep and old in her chest. She looked back only once. "We'll return," Calder said from his horse, voice low beside her. That I promise. The first day passed in quiet conversation and cautious optimism. Sadie asked questions. What if the letter was a mistake? What if Mama's really gone? What if this friend is just playing games? Ella didn't have the answers. But Calder's presence beside them helped hold the uncertainty at bay. Every time Ella's doubts rose, he met her gaze, steady, reassuring, like the earth itself. That night, they camped beneath a stretch of sky so wide it felt like forever. The stars blazed silver above them, and Calder set the fire while Ella laid out the blankets. Sadie fell asleep quickly. Ella didn't. She sat by the fire, staring into the glow. Calder joined her after a while, passing her a tin mug of warm coffee. I can't stop wondering what I'll find, she admitted. I was a girl when she died. Or when I thought she died. What if I don't recognize her? What if she doesn't want to be found? Calder didn't rush to respond. He never did. Then we deal with that together, he said. Whatever we find, truth, pain, hope, we face it side by side. Ella looked at him, the firelight dancing in his eyes. You always say the right thing. I don't know if it's right, he murmured, but it's honest. And for a long time they said nothing more. But in the silence, hearts moved closer. Not from fear, but trust. At dawn, they continued on. By mid-afternoon, the trail narrowed. And then in the distance, a flicker of smoke. A house. A porch. And a woman in a gray shawl standing there staring down the road, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for years. The wagon slowed as they neared the house. It was small, weather-worn, with ivy curling up the front posts, and shutters faded from years of wind and sun. Smoke trailed lazily from the chimney, and the scent of wood fire drifted down the road, warm and oddly familiar. Ella's breath caught in her throat. The woman standing on the porch had the same auburn hair pulled back in a twist, the same posture, back straight, hands folded in front. Her eyes, though older and lined, held something fierce, something Ella remembered in flashes, a lullaby in winter, a laugh in the garden, a touch that made the world feel safe. Ella, the woman said, voice hoarse but unmistakable. Sadie gasped. Mama? The woman stepped down from the porch, as if afraid the illusion might shatter with too much motion. I thought... Ella's voice broke. We thought you died. I nearly did, the woman whispered, her hand trembling as she reached out. But someone pulled me from the house before it burned. A stranger. He saved me, but he couldn't find either of you. By the time I came to, they told me you were gone, that there were no survivors, that I had lost both of you. Sadie ran into her mother's arms, tears falling freely. Ella followed slower, as if still caught between two worlds, grief and grace. They stood there a long time, three hearts finding their way back to one another in the open silence of the hills. Calder watched from a short distance, his hat in his hands, the moment too sacred to intrude upon. But Ella turned, eyes bright with tears and gratitude. She walked to him, her voice soft but unwavering. You gave me this, she said. You gave yourself this, he replied. No, she said, reaching for his hand. You gave me a life I didn't know I could want, and I don't want it without you in it. He didn't speak. He just stepped closer, wrapped his arms around her, and let her lean into his chest like she'd belonged there all along. Later, in the warmth of the house her mother now called home, they sat at a worn wooden table, sharing soup and stories. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Sadie played with a dusty old music box their mother had saved through the years. So, what happens now? Their mother asked gently. Ella looked to Calder, then back to her mother. We go home, she said, all of us. But not everyone had forgotten the Granger name, and not everyone was ready to let the past rest quietly in Bitter Ridge. The final chapter of this journey was just beginning. The first few days in Bitter Ridge passed in a golden haze of reunion. Ella, Sadie, and their mother, Margaret, walked the land behind the little house, retracing old memories and discovering new ones. The nights were filled with whispered stories, tears neither daughter had let fall in years, and healing that didn't need to be rushed. Calder stayed nearby but gave them space, only stepping in when needed, fixing the chimney's draw, helping chop firewood, or tending the horses. But every time Ella looked over her shoulder, he was there, not as a shadow, but as a steady flame. On the fourth morning, while Calder was walking back from the ridge with a fresh kill slung over his shoulder, he saw them. Two riders. Too clean to be ranchers, too quiet to be neighbors. They stopped in town, asked questions, subtle but pointed. He watched them through the trees as they leaned in close to the barkeep, then the blacksmith. No names were mentioned, but Calder knew the scent of trouble when it drifted on the wind. He returned to the house with tight shoulders and sharper eyes. That night, he and Ella sat outside on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the moon rise over the hills. "They're asking about your family," he told her. "Two men. Don't belong here." Ella's lips pressed into a thin line. "Matthew's friends? Maybe. Or someone worse. The Grangers had land, Ella. Land folks would kill to own." Ella turned her face toward him. "Do you think it's still about what we ran from?" "I think unfinished things always find a way back," he replied. She reached for his hand. "I don't want to keep running. I want to build something with you." He turned to her, his voice low. "Then we stand. Together." Inside, Margaret pulled an old journal from beneath the floorboards. Bound in leather, faded and brittle with time, it had survived the fire by miracle. Or by hiding. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling, and turned to the last page. There, in her husband's handwriting, was a list of names. Investors. Threats. Men who'd wanted the land when he refused to sell. And at the bottom, Matthew Kane. And beneath that, Marshal Walter Harlan. A name Ella hadn't heard before, but one Calder would recognize. A man who had the law in his pocket, and a grudge against anyone who defied him. The past wasn't finished, but this time, they weren't running. They were going to fight, together. And for the first time, the Granger women weren't alone. The name Walter Harlan settled like dust on the table, silent but impossible to ignore. Calder stared at the journal Margaret had placed before him, his jaw tense. "I know that name," he said finally. "Marshal over in Silver Hollow. Big man, bigger ego. Used to run cattle rings on the side until someone tried to out him." "Someone?" Ella asked. Calder nodded once. "My brother." Silence fell. Sadie looked between them. "What happened?" "He disappeared," Calder said. "Never found his horse. Never found him." Margaret leaned forward, voice tight with regret. "Your father always said there was something wrong with Harlan. He offered to buy our land 3 times. When we refused, the accident started. Fires. Fences cut. Then the fire that was supposed to take me too." Her voice trailed off. Ella swallowed hard. "And Matthew was just his tool." "Or his way back in," Calder muttered. They all knew what this meant. The storm wasn't over. It had just shifted shape. The next morning, Calder rode into town alone. He moved through the main street with purpose, stopping at the telegraph office. He sent word to a retired judge he trusted in Helena, a man who owed his brother a favor. Then he visited the sheriff's office. Sheriff Billings was old, fair, and tired of big men with bigger shadows. "You think Harlan's got men out here?" the sheriff asked. "I know it," Calder replied. "And if the Granger girls aren't protected, they'll be swallowed whole." Billings rubbed his beard. "I'll keep eyes open. But if you're going after Harlan, it won't be through legal doors." "I'm not looking for revenge," Calder said, standing. "I'm looking for the truth. And peace. For them." The sheriff didn't stop him. Didn't have to. He knew men like Calder didn't break laws lightly. But they didn't stand by while good folks got burned either. Back at the house, Ella was gathering supplies. Margaret stitched a travel bag. Sadie read through the journal again, hunting for names that might still be alive. Calder returned as the sun was dipping low. "I sent for help," he told them. "But we can't wait to act. We need to get to Silver Hollow before Harlan decides to come here first." Ella stepped forward, eyes strong. "Then we ride tomorrow." He looked at her, his voice soft but sure. "It's not just about the land anymore. Not even justice. It's about ending the fear. For good." She nodded. "For our future." That night, the stars above seemed brighter than ever. But none of them slept soundly. Because tomorrow, they would ride into the lion's den, not as victims, not as runaways, but as a family, ready to face whatever the West still had left to throw at them. They rode out just after sunrise. The sky blushed pink along the horizon, streaked with pale gold, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ella rode beside Calder, her hat low over her eyes, a coil of resolve tightening in her chest. Behind them, Sadie clutched the journal like a lifeline, her face determined despite the tension in her posture. Margaret rode behind, calm and quiet, her shawl tucked tightly beneath her coat. They were 4 against a name that carried weight like thunder, Walter Harlan. But they had something Harlan never expected, truth and each other. Silver Hollow came into view by mid-morning. A tidy little town, its streets swept clean, its buildings straight and well-painted. It looked respectable, peaceful, but Calder knew better. "The prettier the storefront," he said under his breath, "the more rot hiding behind the curtains." They dismounted outside the saloon, tying the horses in silence. Ella looked around. "Where first?" "The land office," Calder said. "We prove the land was stolen, connect Harlan to the Granger fire, and we make it public. Fast. Inside, the clerk gave them a lazy once-over until Margaret stepped forward. "I'm Margaret Granger," she said, her voice clear and unafraid. "And I'm here to reclaim what's mine." The clerk paled. We were told you'd perished." "I didn't," she replied. "Now show me the transfer records." Calder stood behind her, arms crossed. His presence made the man comply quickly. Within minutes they had it. The signature on the deed. The supposed transfer from Margaret to the county was forged. Sloppy, done in haste, and right below it, signed as a witness, Marshal Walter Harlan. Outside, the town square had begun to stir. Word of the Granger return had traveled faster than expected. Curious faces appeared in windows. A few whispers followed them as they stepped into the street. And then Harlan appeared, riding tall, dressed sharp, a polished star on his chest and two men flanking him. He dismounted slowly, his smile thin and cold. "Well," he drawled, "if it ain't the ghosts of yesterday." "No ghosts," Calder said flatly. "Just the truth." Harlan's eyes flicked to the journal in Sadie's hands. Then to Margaret. "You've made a mistake," he said. "Coming here. Stirring up history best left buried." "It's only buried if it's dead," Margaret replied. "And I'm very much alive." The confrontation drew a crowd. The sheriff of Silver Hollow stood nearby, watching. Then came the voice Calder had hoped for. "Is there a problem here?" An older man stepped off the stagecoach, dressed in a dusty coat, spectacles perched low on his nose. Judge Ansel Boyd, retired, respected, and Calder's final ace. "I've come to oversee a hearing," Boyd announced. "And from what I've read on the ride, there's plenty that needs clearing." Harlan's smirk faltered. The crowd leaned in, and for the first time in years, the Granger name was no longer a whisper of tragedy, but the spark of something bigger. The town hall filled faster than anyone expected. Benches creaked beneath the weight of townsfolk who had come for the spectacle. Some out of curiosity, others out of long-held suspicion about the man in the iron star. At the front, Judge Boyd took his seat at a makeshift bench, his gavel resting beside him like a quiet threat. Calder stood beside Ella, a steady wall of calm. Sadie clutched the journal to her chest, eyes scanning the crowd. Margaret sat with quiet dignity, hands folded neatly, her posture unwavering despite the eyes upon her. She had waited years for this day. She wasn't going to blink now. Walter Harlan entered through the side door, alone this time. He walked like a man still convinced the law would bend around his boots. But the room had changed, and he felt it. Judge Boyd opened the hearing with a calm voice but a firm tone. "We are here to examine the claim that Marshal Harlan forged land deeds, manipulated a fire investigation, and conspired to intimidate the Granger family for personal gain. The claim comes not only with verbal testimony, but with documented evidence." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ella stepped forward first. Her voice didn't shake. She explained how her father had refused to sell their land, how the fire that claimed their home was called an accident, until her mother, long believed dead, was found alive. She held up the journal, read from the last pages, and presented the forged deed signed by Harlan himself. Then Sadie approached the front. She opened the journal to a folded paper tucked inside, a map with Harlan's own markings, tied to land parcels to be reclaimed. It was damning. "I didn't understand what this meant before," she said, her voice clear. "But now I do. He planned all of it, and we paid the price." The room shifted again. Harlan stood. "You going to take the word of a woman who disappeared for 10 years? A girl? A drifter with a grudge?" He looked at Calder. "You think you're the only one who's lost family?" "No," Calder replied. "But I didn't burn anyone's down to get ahead." Judge Boyd raised this forged document and tapped the signature line. "I know this handwriting," he said. "Walter, you signed dozens of reports under my watch. This isn't just false, it's criminal." Harlan's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. Instead, Sheriff Billings stepped through the back of the room. "You're under arrest," he said, calm and deliberate, "for arson, forgery, and abuse of office." Two deputies flanked the marshal before he could reach for anything more than a breath. Outside, the town had gone quiet. But as Harlan was escorted to the jailhouse, a slow ripple of applause began to rise. Not loud, not showy, but honest, like rain falling after a long drought. Ella turned to Calder. "It's done." He nodded. "It's just begun." She reached for his hand. "Then let's begin. Together." The sky over Silver Hollow was streaked with gold and lavender as the Granger family prepared to leave. For the first time in years, Ella, Sadie, and Margaret stood not as survivors, but as rightful owners of their story, their land, and their future. Judge Boyd had finalized the documentation swiftly, with the townspeople watching in quiet support as he returned the deed to Margaret's hands. The Granger homestead, once thought lost to flames and corruption, was legally and wholly theirs again. But it was more than a victory in court. It was a turning point in every sense. Calder stood outside the town hall, saddling the horses as Ella walked toward him. She looked different now, not just stronger, but lighter, as if something she'd carried for far too long had finally been set down. "You sure you're ready to go back?" he asked, adjusting the cinch on her saddle. She smiled. "Back? No, forward." He looked at her then, brows lifted. "I mean, not just back to the cabin," she said. "I'm ready to build something permanent. A new house, new land, maybe new promises." He nodded slowly. "I've been ready." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "Then let's stop surviving, Calder. Let's live." And he kissed her. Not rushed, not uncertain, but with the steady certainty of a man who had waited years to feel something this real. Sadie rode beside them on the way home, her face glowing with energy. "I want chickens," she declared. "And maybe a goat. Something stubborn." "You already fill that role," Ella teased. Margaret chuckled from the back of the wagon. "And I'll need a garden. Something to keep these hands busy." "Something with tomatoes," Calder added. "I never had a good one until Ella cooked." She glanced at him, amused. "So that's how I won you?" "Wasn't just the stew," he said with a wink. As the hills grew familiar again, the land opened before them. Wide, quiet, waiting. The cabin came into view, but already Ella was picturing what they'd build beside it. A bigger porch, a second bedroom for Sadie, a root cellar, a garden, a table long enough to seat a future they hadn't dared imagine before. Not so long ago it had all seemed impossible. But now? Now it was home. That evening, as the stars blinked to life, Ella stood beside Calder in the doorway of the cabin, her hand tucked inside his. "You still think about your brother?" she asked gently. "Every day," he said, "but I think he'd like where I ended up." She leaned against him, her voice soft. "So do I." Tomorrow, there would be fences to mend, seeds to plant, and a life to grow. But tonight was for peace, for love earned the hard way, and for the family forged, not just by blood or past, but by fire, storm, and the courage to stay. When the first hammer struck wood before the sun had cleared the hills, Calder worked with quiet determination, every nail driven into the frame of the new home like a promise. Ella stood beside him, her sleeves rolled high and her hair tied back, measuring beams and double-checking plans they'd drawn together by lantern light. Behind them, Sadie painted a wooden sign for the future gate, tongue between her teeth in focus. "Granger and Beck Homestead," it read. She looked at it proudly, then added in smaller, almost hidden letters beneath, "Where we stopped running." By the end of the week, the frame was complete. The walls went up slowly, carefully, piece by piece, like the life they were building. Neighbors came by to help, dropping off extra boards, a loaf of bread, or a simple thank you for what they'd done in Silver Hollow. Margaret planted roots of her own in the soil behind the cabin, her hands in the dirt, her eyes misty. "I thought I'd never touch this land again," she whispered. "But now it feels like it never left me." At night, they gathered on the porch with cups of tea, wrapped in soft shawls and quiet warmth. The stars stretched overhead in endless patterns, and for the first time in so long, no one looked over their shoulder. One night, Calder sat beside Ella and pulled a small, worn box from his coat pocket. "I didn't think I'd ever use this," he said. "But if there's one thing this land taught me, it's that some things are worth waiting for." Ella opened the box slowly. Inside was a simple silver band, smoothed by time. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not just on the land, but with me, as mine and I yours." Tears sprang to her eyes, not from fear, not from grief, but from rightness. "Yes," she said, "for the rest of our days." Sadie screamed with joy when she found out. Margaret cried openly, and even the wind seemed to carry the moment gently across the fields. A month later, they were married beneath the cottonwoods, a few neighbors watching, the sun warm on their faces. There was no pomp, no lavish celebration, just honesty, laughter, and the scent of pine in the air. As Calder and Ella exchanged vows, Sadie whispered to her mother, "We made it, didn't we?" Margaret squeezed her hand. "No, sweetheart, we built it." But not far beyond the hills, a letter was being written, sealed with a wax stamp bearing a new name. Someone else had been watching the trial. Someone with claims on the land surrounding Bitter Ridge, and someone who didn't like what the Grangers had reclaimed. The past was no longer their greatest threat. The future would demand just as much courage. The morning breeze carried a scent Ella didn't recognize, smoke faint but unnatural. She stepped out onto the porch, hand shielding her eyes from the sun. The fields stretched wide and golden, the newly built house behind her still smelling of fresh pine and home. But off in the distance, beyond the north ridge, A thin, unnatural plume coiled into the sky. Not a brush fire. Something deliberate. Calder saw it too. He rode out within the hour, returning near sundown, his face set in a way Ella hadn't seen in weeks. She met him at the gate. What is it? He dismounted slowly. Someone's burning claims along the north slope. Land just past your family's old boundary line. Granger land? Used to be, before everything fell apart. No one's lived there since the fire. Until now. He handed her a folded note, delivered to the town clerk, unsigned. Some land shouldn't be revived. The valley belongs to those strong enough to take it. Ella's hands trembled. Someone's challenging the claim? Someone's watching, Calder corrected, and testing to see if we'll fight for it. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table, the oil lamp casting soft light across familiar faces. What does it mean? Sadie asked. Will they try to take it all? Unlikely, Calder said. But this land's valuable. Water, timber, trade routes nearby. Whoever's doing this, they waited until they thought we'd settle and stop watching. But we are watching, Margaret said, her voice firm, and we're not going anywhere. Ella looked across the table at her husband, her mother, her sister. This wasn't just land. It was legacy, healing, a future paid for in fire, water, and love. If it's a fight they want, she said, they'll find more than they bargained for. The next morning, Calder met with the town council in Silver Hollow. An official complaint had been filed, anonymous, of course, claiming that Grangers had abandoned the land and had no right to reclaim it after so many years. But the forged deeds had been exposed, and Judge Boyd's testimony still held weight. What troubled Calder more was who wasn't behind it. Not Harlan, not Matthew. Someone new, someone with deeper pockets and a longer reach. Meanwhile, Ella and Sadie rode out to the North Ridge. Where the meadow once bloomed, charred earth now stretched like a warning. Wooden posts marked new boundaries, freshly planted, stamped with a carved symbol neither of them recognized. A wolf's head, painted in red. They returned home silent. But that night, Calder carved a new sign and drove it into the earth just beyond the porch. Granger and Beck Homestead, this land stands. And it would, no matter who tried to shake it. The final confrontation didn't come with fire or gunshots. It came on horseback. Just before dawn, 5 riders appeared at the edge of the Granger property. They wore clean vests and sharp boots, men with money behind them, not sweat. At the center rode a man in a gray coat, silver hair tied at the neck, his gloved hands resting gently on the reins like he owned everything he saw. He didn't speak at first, just looked. Ella stood on the porch, arms folded across her chest. Calder stepped beside her, rifle slung over one shoulder, not drawn, but not far. You the ones marking our land? Ella asked. The man in the gray coat smiled politely. We are marking what was left behind. Land with no title, no future, until now. You're mistaken, she said. This land has both. The man dismounted. You must be Mrs. Beck, he said. I'm Roland Tresson. My family's been investing in Western territories for 2 generations. We buy forgotten places and make them new. It was never forgotten, Ella replied. Just stolen. And recovered, Calder added, stepping down beside her. Which makes it not for sale. Roland's smile never faded, but his eyes hardened. Everyone sells eventually. Not us, Sadie said, appearing behind them. Not anymore. Tresson glanced at the red wolf emblem burned into the post at the ridge. I hope you know what you're refusing. I do, Ella said. A future written by someone else. We already lived that story, and nearly died in it. He gave a slow nod, then turned back to his men. Pull the stakes, he said. This ground's not worth the trouble. And just like that, they rode off. No gunfire, no last words. Just dust and silence. And a freedom that echoed louder than any fight. Weeks later, life returned to rhythm. The new house stood strong. The fields were seeded. The first buds of spring reached toward the sky like they, too, believed in second chances. Margaret planted a rose bush outside the front window, one that would bloom in time like the family who now thrived beside it. Sadie took in a stray dog that followed her home one afternoon. She named him Storm. And Calder built a cradle. Ella didn't ask when he started, only smiled when she found it, perfectly carved, waiting in the corner of their room. She ran a hand along the smooth edges. We're not running anymore, she whispered. He pulled her close. No, ma'am, we're staying. Growing. Years from now, folks would still talk about the sisters pulled from the river, the cowboy who never walked away, the fire, the trial, the man in the badge, the woman who came back from the dead. But mostly, they'd talk about the homestead, the one that stood when no one thought it would. Because some lands don't just hold roots, they hold hearts.